Millbrook, Ohio looked perfect from the outside. White picket fences, well-maintained lawns, friendly people waving from their porches. It took me exactly 17 minutes to realize that every person waving had the same face, the same genetic template copied and pasted across an entire population. Men, women, children, all wearing identical features like masks that couldn't come off. My name is Special Agent Sarah Martinez, and I've been with the FBI for 22 years. I've worked everything from organized crime to domestic terrorism, from serial murder cases to international espionage. I thought I'd seen the darkest corners of human nature, the most twisted minds our species could produce. I was wrong. What I discovered in Millbrook, Ohio in the summer of 2019 wasn't just a crime. It was a violation of every natural law I thought I understood. It was a glimpse into something so fundamentally wrong that it still haunts my dreams. Still makes me question the very nature of identity, humanity, and reality itself. The case started like so many others, with missing people and unanswered questions. It ended with me filing a report that sits in a classified vault somewhere in Quantico, marked with security clearances that most agents will never see. This is that story. It was a sweltering Tuesday morning in July when Assistant Director Patterson called me into his office at the Cleveland field office. Patterson was old-school FBI, crew-cut, pressed suit, the kind of agent who still believed that methodology and persistence could solve any case. "Martinez," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. "I've got something unusual for you." I'd been working a human trafficking case for the past 6 months, so unusual was a relative term. But Patterson had a look in his eyes I'd never seen before, uncertainty mixed with something that might have been fear. 3 families from a small town called Millbrook, Ohio went missing 2 weeks ago, he continued, sliding a file across his desk. Local law enforcement is stumped. State police called us in yesterday. I opened the file. The missing families were the Johnsons, the Williamses, and the Hartmans. 15 people total, ranging in age from 6 to 73. They'd vanished from their homes simultaneously, leaving behind no signs of struggle, no ransom demands, no digital footprints. "Mass disappearance," I said, flipping through the photographs of suburban homes and smiling families. "Possible cult recruitment? Human trafficking ring?" "That's what we thought initially," Patterson said. "But here's where it gets strange. According to the initial reports, these families were seen around town the day after they were reported missing. False reports? Mistaken identity? Multiple witnesses. The local sheriff insists he spoke with Robert Johnson at the gas station 3 days after Johnson's wife filed the missing persons report." I studied the case files more carefully. Millbrook, Ohio, population 4,247 according to the last census. One of those small Midwestern towns that time seemed to have forgotten, where everybody knew everybody and strangers stood out like neon signs. "What did the local sheriff say when you asked him about the contradiction?" Patterson's expression darkened. "That's just it. When our Cincinnati office called to follow up, Sheriff Collins said there was no missing persons case, no families named Johnson, Williams, or Hartman. According to him, there never were any missing people." The hair on the back of my neck prickled. Someone got to him? Maybe. Or maybe something else is going on. That's what I need you to find out. I left Cleveland the next morning, driving south through Ohio farmland toward a town that was supposedly hiding 15 missing people. The drive gave me time to study the case files more thoroughly, and the more I read, the stranger things became. The missing families had all lived in Millbrook for generations. The Johnsons had owned the local hardware store for 60 years. The Williamses ran the only restaurant in town. The Hartmans operated a small insurance agency. These weren't transient people who might disappear on a whim. They were pillars of the community. But according to the follow-up reports, these pillars had somehow become invisible to the very community they'd served for decades. I reached Millbrook around noon, the summer sun beating down on endless fields of corn and soybeans. The town appeared exactly as I'd expected from the photos in the file. A collection of neat houses arranged around a small downtown core, complete with a water tower, a few local businesses, and tree-lined streets that belonged on a postcard. I parked in front of the sheriff's station, a small brick building that also housed the volunteer fire department. As I gathered my files and prepared to meet Sheriff Collins, I noticed a woman watering her garden across the street. She looked up and waved, a friendly, normal gesture that I returned automatically. That was the first face I saw in Millbrook. I wish I'd paid more attention to it at the time, because 17 minutes later, I would realize that every other face in town was exactly the same. Sheriff Collins was waiting for me in his office, a sparse room decorated with the usual mixture of community service awards and law enforcement memorabilia. He was a man in his 50s with graying hair, a slight paunch, and the easy manner of someone who'd spent his entire career dealing with minor disputes and traffic violations. "Agent Martinez," he said, standing to shake my hand. "Appreciate you coming down, but I'm afraid there might be some confusion about why you're here." I sat down across from his desk and opened my case file. 3 missing families, Sheriff. The Johnsons, Williamses, and Hartmans. 15 people total. The reports were filed 2 weeks ago. Sheriff Collins frowned and reached for a stack of papers on his desk. "I've been going through our records since your office called. Agent Martinez, there's no record of any missing persons reports filed in the past month, and I've lived in this town my entire life. There are no families by those names living here." "No Johnsons? Robert Johnson, age 45, wife, Margaret, 2 children?" "No, ma'am." "Williams family? Hartmans?" "Never heard of them." I studied Sheriff Collins's face carefully. He seemed genuinely confused, not evasive or deceptive. Either he was an exceptional liar, or he truly believed what he was telling me. "Sheriff, these reports were filed with your department. I have copies of the paperwork here." I showed him the missing persons forms, complete with case numbers and official stamps. Collins examined the papers with growing bewilderment. These look legitimate. The case numbers follow our system. The forms are correct. But I swear to you, Agent Martinez, I never filed these reports. And I would remember if 15 people went missing from my town." Something was very wrong here, but I couldn't put my finger on what. Sheriff Collins seemed honest and competent, but the evidence in my hands contradicted everything he was telling me. "Would you mind if I spoke with some of the townspeople? Maybe visited the addresses listed in these reports?" "Of course," Collins said. "I'll come with you. Maybe we can figure out what's going on here." Our first stop was 347 Maple Street, listed in the file as the Johnson family residence. It was a 2-story colonial with yellow siding and a well-maintained garden. As we approached the front door, I could see movement through the kitchen window. "Someone's home," I observed. Sheriff Collins knocked on the door. After a moment, it opened to reveal a middle-aged man with brown hair and friendly eyes. He smiled and greeted us warmly. "Sheriff Collins, how are you doing? And you must be the FBI agent we heard was coming to town." I felt a moment of relief. Here was evidence that the missing families did exist, that someone in town was aware of the federal investigation. "Mr. I began, pulling out my notebook. "Robert Thompson," the man said. "I run the hardware store downtown. What can I help you with?" I looked down at my case file, then back at the man. According to my records, Robert Johnson ran the hardware store and lived at this address. But this man had just identified himself as Robert Thompson. "I'm looking for the Johnson family," I said carefully. "Robert Johnson, his wife Margaret, and their 2 children." Robert Thompson looked genuinely puzzled. "I'm sorry, Agent Martinez, but there's no Johnson family in Millbrook. Never has been, far as I know." Sheriff Collins nodded in agreement. Bob's lived here his whole life. If anyone would know about the families in town, it'd be him. I stared at Robert Thompson, trying to make sense of the contradiction. He looked exactly like the Robert Johnson in my case file. Same height, same build, same facial features, but he was insisting his name was Thompson, not Johnson. Mr. Thompson, how long have you lived at this address? Oh, about 15 years now. Moved here when I married my wife, Linda. She grew up in this house. It's been in her family for generations. And you run the hardware store? Thompson Hardware. Yes, ma'am. Been in business since 1962 when my father-in-law started it. Every detail matched the Johnson family profile, except for the names. It was as if someone had taken Robert Johnson and simply changed his identity, leaving everything else exactly the same. We visited the other addresses listed in my files with identical results. At 423 Oak Street, we found David Williams running a small restaurant, except he insisted his name was David Peterson, and the restaurant was called Peterson's Family Diner instead of Williams' Family Restaurant. At 156 Pine Street, we met Charles Hartman, who claimed to be Charles Mitchell and ran an insurance agency called Mitchell & Associates. Each person we met matched the physical descriptions and life details of the missing families perfectly, but they all had different names and no memory of ever being called by their supposed original identities. It was during our fourth visit that I first consciously noticed the faces. We were at the elementary school, where I wanted to check the enrollment records for the missing children. The principal, a woman named Mrs. Davidson, was walking us through the hallways when she stopped to greet a teacher. Agent Martinez, this is Miss Rodriguez, our third-grade teacher. I shook Miss Rodriguez's hand and made polite conversation, but something was nagging at me. When we continued down the hallway and met the janitor, Mr. Patterson, the feeling grew stronger. It wasn't until we encountered the school nurse, Mrs. Kelly, that the pieces clicked into place. They all had the same face. Not similar faces. The exact same face. The same bone structure. The same eye color and shape, the same nose, the same mouth, the same facial proportions. Miss Rodriguez, Mr. Patterson, and Mrs. Kelly were obviously different people, different ages, different genders, different clothes and hairstyles, but they wore identical faces like they'd been stamped from the same mold. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, that I was seeing patterns that didn't exist. But as we left the school and walked down Main Street, I started paying closer attention to every person we passed. The mailman sorting letters at the post office, the teenager bagging groceries at the corner market, the elderly woman feeding pigeons in the town square, the construction worker repairing a sidewalk. All of them had the exact same face. I excused myself from Sheriff Collins and found a quiet spot near my car to process what I was seeing. I pulled out my phone and pretended to make a call while actually observing the people of Millbrook going about their daily routines. A mother pushing a stroller down the sidewalk. Same face. Her toddler walking beside her. Same face. Scaled down to child proportions. A businessman entering the bank. Same face. Two teenagers laughing together outside the ice cream shop. Both had the same face. It wasn't possible. It defied genetics, biology, every law of nature I understood. But it was happening right in front of me. I started taking discreet photos with my phone, being careful not to attract attention. Through my camera lens, the impossible became documented fact. Every person I photographed had identical facial features, as if an entire town had been populated by variations of the same individual. Men and women, young and old, different heights and builds, but all sharing the same face with mathematical precision, the same distance between the eyes, the same curve of the lips, the same angle of the cheekbones. Agent Martinez? Sheriff Collins appeared at my elbow. Everything all right? You look a little pale. I turned to look at him directly for the first time since arriving in Millbrook. Sheriff Collins had the same face as everyone else. I managed to keep my composure during the rest of my initial visit to Millbrook, though every interaction felt like walking through a nightmare disguised as a daydream. I scheduled a follow-up visit for the next day and drove back to Cleveland in a state of controlled panic. That evening, I spread the photos I'd taken across my apartment floor like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Using a ruler and magnifying glass, I compared facial measurements with obsessive precision. The distance between pupils, the width of noses, the length from hairline to chin, every measurement was identical across different people. I ran the photos through facial recognition software, the same programs we use to identify suspects and missing persons. The computer couldn't differentiate between any of the faces. According to the algorithms, every person in Millbrook, Ohio was the same individual. But that was impossible. I called my colleague in the Bureau's Behavioral Analysis Unit, Dr. Patricia Vance, a forensic psychologist who specialized in unusual cases. "Patricia, I need to run something by you. Hypothetically, is it possible for an entire population to share identical facial features?" "You mean like ethnic similarities? Isolated populations sometimes show—" "No, I mean identical. Exact genetic matches across unrelated individuals." There was a long pause. "Sarah, that's not how genetics works. Even identical twins have subtle differences when you look closely enough. Are you working some kind of identity theft case?" "Something like that. What about environmental factors, radiation exposure, chemical contamination?" "Those might cause similar birth defects in a localized population, but identical features across multiple generations. That's not scientifically possible." After I hung up, I spent hours researching genetic anomalies, isolated populations, and environmental mutagenesis. Nothing I found could explain what I'd witnessed in Millbrook. The next morning, I drove back to Ohio with a head full of theories and a gut full of dread. My second visit to Millbrook was more systematic. I arrived with a detailed plan to document the population anomaly and gather evidence that might explain what I was seeing. I set up my unofficial headquarters at the town's only motel, a modest establishment called the Millbrook Inn. The desk clerk who checked me in had the same face as everyone else I'd met. I was starting to recognize subtle variations, different expressions, different ways of wearing the identical features, but the underlying structure was always identical. "First time in Millbrook?" the clerk asked pleasantly. "Second visit," I replied. "Lovely town." "We like it here. Quiet, friendly folks. Everyone looks out for each other." That phrase, "everyone looks out for each other," would prove to be more literal than I initially understood. I spent the day conducting informal interviews with townspeople, pretending to be working on a routine federal survey about rural law enforcement resources. My real purpose was to gather basic demographic information and look for any clues about the population's unusual uniformity. What I discovered was even stranger than the identical faces. Despite their shared physical appearance, the people of Millbrook had distinct personalities, different life experiences, and separate family histories. Robert Thompson genuinely believed he was a different person than David Peterson, despite their identical appearance. They had different memories, different skills, different interests. Mrs. Davidson, the elementary school principal, showed me class photos going back decades. Every face in every photo was the same, but the names written underneath were all different. According to the school records, the town had maintained a stable population for over 50 years, with new residents arriving regularly and others occasionally moving away. But every single resident, regardless of when they'd arrived or how long they'd lived there, had the same face. I contacted the county coroner, Dr. James Wright, and requested permission to review any recent autopsy reports from Millbrook residents. Dr. Wright was helpful, but puzzled by my interest. "Not much call for autopsies in Millbrook," he told me during our phone conversation. "Peaceful town, mostly natural deaths from old age or illness." "Why are you asking?" "Routine federal health survey," I lied, "looking at mortality patterns in rural communities." Dr. Wright provided me with reports from the past 5 years. 7 deaths total, all from natural causes. What caught my attention wasn't the cause of death, but the detailed physical descriptions in each report. Every deceased resident of Millbrook had identical bone structure measurements. Height and weight varied, but skull dimensions, facial bone proportions, and dental characteristics were mathematically identical across different individuals. From a forensic standpoint, it was as if the same person had died 7 times. I arranged to meet with Dr. Wright at the county morgue, where he walked me through the most recent case, an elderly man named George Patterson who'd died of heart failure 3 weeks earlier. Lived in Millbrook his whole life, Dr. Wright explained as we reviewed the case file. 83 years old, worked at the grain elevator until he retired. Nice family man. Did you notice anything unusual about the body during the examination? Unusual how? Physical abnormalities, signs of medical procedures, anything that stood out? Dr. Wright thought for a moment. Now that you mention it, George had remarkably good bone density for his age. Usually, men in their 80s show significant deterioration, but his skeleton looked almost like a 40-year-old's, and his dental work was interesting. Interesting how? Perfect. I mean, mathematically perfect. His teeth were aligned with precision I've only seen in high-end cosmetic dentistry, but according to his medical records, he never had orthodontic work done. Born with a perfect smile, apparently. I felt that familiar chill running down my spine. Dr. Wright, in your professional opinion, is it possible for someone to be born with naturally perfect teeth? Possible, yes, but extremely rare. And George's teeth weren't just straight. They were identical in size and shape to a degree I've never seen in natural dentition. Over the following days, I expanded my investigation beyond Millbrook's borders. I contacted neighboring towns, county records offices, and state agencies, looking for any reference to the missing families or any explanation for the town's unusual demographics. What I found was a pattern of administrative confusion surrounding Millbrook, Ohio. According to state records, the town's population had remained remarkably stable at around 4,200 people for the past 30 years. Birth and death rates balanced perfectly, with new residents arriving at exactly the rate needed to replace those who moved away or died. But the documentation didn't match the reality. I found records of families moving to Millbrook who didn't appear in local directories. I discovered death certificates for people who were still alive and walking around town. Marriage licenses listed couples who claimed never to have been married. It was as if Millbrook existed in a state of bureaucratic limbo, where official records bore no relation to actual events. The most disturbing discovery came when I cross-referenced driver's license photos from the Ohio Department of Motor Vehicles. Every resident of Millbrook who'd gotten a license in the past 20 years had submitted the same photograph. Not similar photos, but identical images that appeared to be the exact same picture printed multiple times with different names. The DMV had apparently never noticed that hundreds of different people were using identical photographs for their official identification. On my 5th day in Millbrook, I decided to confront the situation directly. I arranged a meeting with Sheriff Collins and several prominent townspeople at the town hall, ostensibly to discuss federal resources for rural law enforcement. The meeting was attended by Mayor Johnson, who looked exactly like the missing Robert Johnson but insisted his first name was William, City Clerk Patterson, Fire Chief Davidson, and several other community leaders. As I sat at the conference table surrounded by identical faces, the surreal nature of the situation became almost overwhelming. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, "I need to address something unusual I've observed during my time in your community." They looked at me with polite attention, all wearing the same expression of mild curiosity on the same face. "I've noticed that many of your residents bear a strong resemblance to each other, remarkably strong." Mayor Johnson smiled. Well, Agent Martinez, Millbrook is a close-knit community. We're like one big family here. That's exactly what I mean, I said, pulling out my folder of photographs. When I say resemblance, I mean identical. Every person in this town has the exact same facial features. I spread the photos across the conference table. The town leaders looked down at the images with what appeared to be genuine confusion. "I'm not sure I understand what you're showing us," Sheriff Collins said. "These are photographs of different residents of Millbrook. Look at the faces. Really look." They examined the photos carefully, passing them around the table and discussing them in low voices. Their reactions seemed authentic. They appeared to be seeing normal variation where I saw impossible uniformity. "Agent Martinez," City Clerk Patterson said finally, "these look like regular photographs of our neighbors to me. I see Mr. Thompson from the hardware store, Mrs. Rodriguez from the school, young Billy Henderson from the gas station. They all look like themselves." "But they all have the same face," I insisted. The room fell silent. The town leaders exchanged glances that might have been meaningful if I could have differentiated between their expressions. "Agent Martinez," Mayor Johnson said gently, "I think you might be experiencing some kind of stress reaction. These are clearly different people. Maybe you should consider taking a break from your investigation." Frustrated by the townspeople's inability to see what was obvious to me, I decided to gather more concrete evidence. I contacted the FBI's forensic laboratory in Quantico and arranged for a mobile DNA testing unit to be dispatched to Millbrook under the cover of a routine federal health survey. The team arrived 2 days later in an unmarked van, posing as CDC researchers conducting a study on genetic diversity in rural populations. Agent Martinez had volunteered to act as liaison, which gave me the perfect excuse to collect biological samples from multiple residents. We set up our operation in the town hall, offering free health screenings and genetic counseling to anyone who volunteered. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Nearly 200 residents showed up over the course of 3 days, eager to participate in what they believed was important federal research. Each volunteer provided a saliva sample for DNA analysis, submitted to routine biometric measurements, and answered questions about their family medical history. Throughout the process, I carefully observed the interactions between residents, looking for any signs that they were aware of their unusual appearance. They showed no such awareness. Neighbors greeted each other by name, discussed personal matters, and interacted with the familiarity of people who'd known each other for years. From their perspective, they were seeing distinct individuals with recognizable faces and personalities. But from my perspective, I was watching identical people interact as if they were unique individuals, like watching the same actor play multiple roles in the same scene without ever acknowledging the repetition. The DNA results came back a week later, and they confirmed my worst fears. Dr. Elizabeth Kane, the FBI's chief forensic geneticist, called me personally to discuss the results. "Sarah, I've reviewed your samples 3 times, and I need to ask you about your collection methodology. Did you possibly mix up the specimens or collect multiple samples from the same individuals?" "No contamination, no mix-ups," I assured her. "Each sample came from a different person, collected under controlled conditions." "That's problematic, because according to our analysis, all 200 samples came from genetically identical individuals. Not similar, identical. We're looking at DNA profiles that match at every marker we tested." "What does that mean exactly?" "It means you either collected 200 samples from the same person, or you've discovered a population of perfect genetic clones. And Sarah, human cloning technology doesn't exist at this level. We're talking about individuals of different ages, which would require cloning technology that's decades ahead of anything that exists in the public scientific record." I sat in my Cleveland office, staring out the window at normal people with normal faces living normal lives. "Elizabeth, hypothetically, if such technology did exist, what would be required to create a population like this?" "Hypothetically? You'd need a master genetic template, advanced cloning facilities, the ability to accelerate aging in laboratory conditions, sophisticated memory implantation technology to create distinct personalities, and resources that would cost billions of dollars. Plus, you'd have to maintain the program for decades to create a multi-generational population. Government project? Would have to be. Nothing else would have that level of funding and secrecy. But Sarah, I need to emphasize that this technology doesn't exist. What you're describing is science fiction. After I hung up, I sat in my office for a long time, trying to make sense of the impossible evidence. Every test, every measurement, every analysis pointed to the same conclusion. The people of Millbrook, Ohio were genetically identical human clones, living as if they were natural, unrelated individuals. I took the DNA results to Assistant Director Patterson, along with my complete case files and photographic evidence. His reaction was immediate and intense. "Martinez, this stays between us until I can brief the director. If what you're telling me is true, we're looking at the most significant classified program in American history." "Sir, what do you want me to do about Millbrook?" "Nothing. You don't go back there. You don't talk to anyone else about this case, and you don't file any official reports until I give you clearance. This goes straight to Washington." Within 48 hours, my case was transferred to a joint task force involving the FBI, CIA, Department of Defense, and several agencies I'd never heard of. I was debriefed by teams of specialists, subjected to psychological evaluation, and required to sign security agreements that carried the threat of life imprisonment if violated. The official investigation took over, with resources far beyond anything available to a single field agent. But they allowed me to remain involved as the case agent, which meant I got to see the results of their much more sophisticated analysis. What they discovered was even more disturbing than my initial findings. The expanded investigation revealed that Millbrook, Ohio, was one of 12 similar communities scattered across the United States. Each town had a population of 4,000 to 5,000 residents, all genetically identical to each other, but unique compared to the other towns. The communities had been established over a 60-year period, starting in the late 1950s. They were supported by an intricate network of front companies, falsified government records, and sophisticated psychological conditioning programs designed to maintain the illusion that the residents were normal human beings living normal lives. The most shocking discovery was that the residents weren't just genetic clones. They were also psychological constructs. Each individual had been programmed with artificial memories, implanted personalities, and false life histories that created the appearance of unique identities within the identical population. Dr. Marcus Webb, a behavioral psychologist with a top-secret clearance, briefed me on the psychological findings. "The residents of Millbrook don't realize they're clones," he explained during our classified meeting in Washington. "Their memories have been carefully constructed to create consistent but distinct personal histories. They genuinely believe they're separate individuals with unique experiences." "How is that possible?" "Advanced neuroscience combined with decades of behavioral conditioning. Each clone is given a specific role to play: the sheriff, the shopkeeper, the teacher, and their memories are designed to support that role. They're essentially living out scripted lives while believing they're making free choices." "But why? What's the purpose?" Dr. Webb consulted his classified files. "Agent Martinez, what I'm about to tell you is compartmentalized at the highest levels. The Millbrook Project was designed to study human behavior and social dynamics in controlled populations. It's been running for over half a century. Study them for what? To understand how human societies function, how people interact, how communities develop, how social structures emerge and evolve. The identical populations remove variables like genetic diversity, allowing researchers to observe pure social and behavioral patterns." The full scope of the Millbrook Project was staggering. Hidden beneath the picturesque small town was a sophisticated research facility staffed by hundreds of scientists, technicians, and security personnel. The residents lived their entire lives unaware that their community was essentially a giant laboratory designed to study human behavior. Every conversation was recorded. Every interaction was analyzed. Every social development was documented and studied by teams of behavioral scientists, sociologists, and psychologists. The people I'd met, Sheriff Collins, Robert Thompson, Mrs. Davidson, were unwitting research subjects whose entire lives existed for the purpose of scientific observation. The project had been funded by a consortium of government agencies and private corporations, all interested in understanding human behavior for purposes ranging from military applications to marketing research. The data collected from Millbrook and similar communities had influenced everything from urban planning to psychological warfare tactics. But something had gone wrong recently. The missing families I'd originally been sent to investigate were actually researchers who'd been exposed to the project and had tried to document what they'd discovered. They hadn't been kidnapped. They'd been removed by project security when they threatened to reveal the existence of the laboratory communities. The families' identities had been reassigned to clone residents, who'd been implanted with modified memories that convinced them they'd always lived in Millbrook. The original researchers had simply been erased from the town's collective memory through a combination of record falsification and memory adjustment procedures. I was looking at a violation of human rights so vast and systematic that it challenged my understanding of what my own government was capable of doing. During my weeks of debriefing in Washington, I met with officials from the various agencies involved in the Millbrook project. Their justifications for the program were consistent but chilling. "Agent Martinez," explained Dr. Caroline Stevens from the Department of Defense Research Division, "the Millbrook project has generated invaluable data on human social behavior. The research conducted there has contributed to peacekeeping efforts, disaster response planning, and conflict resolution strategies around the world." "By treating human beings as laboratory animals," I replied. "By studying human behavior in its purest form," she corrected. "The residents of Millbrook live happy, fulfilling lives within their community. They form relationships, raise families, pursue careers, and experience all the normal aspects of human existence. The only difference is that their community is designed and monitored for research purposes. They're clones living programmed lives. They have no real autonomy, no genuine choice about their existence." "Do any of us really have genuine choice about our existence?" Dr. Stevens asked. "We're all products of our genetics and environment. The Millbrook residents are simply products of more carefully controlled genetics and environment." The philosophical implications were staggering, but the practical implications were even worse. I was being asked to cover up a program that had been operating for decades, involving thousands of human subjects who had no knowledge of their true nature. The decision about what to do with the Millbrook project ultimately came from the highest levels of government. I was called to a meeting at an undisclosed location in Virginia, where I met with officials whose names and agencies were never revealed to me. "Agent Martinez," said a woman I knew only as Director Smith, "the Millbrook project represents one of the most valuable research programs in the history of behavioral science. The data collected there has applications in national security, public health, and social policy that benefit millions of people. What about the rights of the people living there? The residents of Millbrook are living full, satisfying lives. They have relationships, careers, families, all the things that define human happiness. The fact that their existence serves a larger purpose doesn't diminish the value of their individual experiences. But they don't know the truth about themselves." "Most people don't know the full truth about themselves," Director Smith replied. "The residents of Millbrook know everything that's relevant to their daily lives. They understand their relationships, their community, their personal histories. The larger context of their existence is no more relevant to them than the larger context of the universe is to most people." The decision was made to continue the Millbrook project with enhanced security measures. The communities would be better isolated, the monitoring more sophisticated, and the cover stories more carefully maintained. My original missing persons case would be closed with a finding that the families had relocated voluntarily and requested privacy from federal authorities. I was offered a promotion and transferred to a position that would involve oversight of similar projects around the country. The salary increase alone would have doubled my income. I turned it down. 2 weeks after my final briefing on the Millbrook project, I submitted my resignation from the FBI. I couldn't continue working for an organization that I knew was involved in systematic human experimentation, regardless of the stated benefits or justifications. Assistant Director Patterson tried to talk me out of it during our exit interview. "Martinez, you've had a distinguished career with the Bureau. Don't throw it away over one classified project that's beyond your pay grade." "It's not beyond my pay grade to know right from wrong," I replied. "The people in Millbrook are happy. They have good lives, strong communities, everything that most Americans want. The fact that their existence serves a research purpose doesn't make it inherently wrong. They're being studied like laboratory rats. They have no knowledge of their true nature, no choice about their participation, no ability to consent to what's being done to them. And if they did know? If we told them the truth, what then? Their lives would be destroyed, their sense of identity shattered, their community dissolved. Would that be more ethical?" Patterson's argument haunted me because it contained a grain of truth. The people of Millbrook seemed genuinely happy in their artificial community. They had relationships, goals, achievements, all the components of meaningful human lives. Learning the truth about their nature might indeed destroy everything that gave their existence value. But that didn't make the program right. I left the FBI with a security clearance that prohibited me from discussing the Millbrook project with anyone, ever, under penalty of life imprisonment. The knowledge I carried was classified at levels that most government officials would never see, and revealing it would be considered an act of treason. I moved to Portland, Oregon, and opened a small private investigation practice specializing in missing persons cases. It was my small way of continuing to help people who'd fallen through the cracks of official investigations, though I could never help the people who needed it most, the thousands of human clones living their programmed lives in laboratory towns across America. For 5 years, I tried to build a new life while carrying the weight of what I knew. I helped find runaway teenagers, tracked down deadbeat parents, and investigated insurance fraud. Normal cases involving real people with genuine problems seemed almost refreshingly simple after Millbrook, but I couldn't stop thinking about the faces. In 2024, 5 years after my resignation from the FBI, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a flash drive and a handwritten note that said simply, "You need to see this, a friend." The flash drive contained video files from security cameras throughout Millbrook, Ohio. Hours of footage showing the daily lives of the residents, people going to work, children playing in parks, families having dinner together. Normal human activities performed by people with identical faces. But there was something new in the recent footage. Some of the residents were showing signs of awareness that something was wrong with their community. I watched Sheriff Collins staring at his reflection in a mirror with a confused expression, as if he was seeing something that troubled him but couldn't quite identify what it was. I saw Mrs. Davidson repeatedly counting the children in her classroom, as though she suspected the numbers didn't add up correctly. Most disturbing was footage from the town's general store, where I watched Robert Thompson having a conversation with David Peterson that made no sense from their perspective, but was chilling from mine. "Bob, I had the strangest dream last night," Peterson was saying. "I dreamed I was you, running the hardware store, married to Linda, but I was still me, if that makes sense." "That's funny," Thompson replied. "I've been having dreams where I'm someone else too. Different name, different job, but the same. I don't know how to describe it." "Same what?" "Same me, I guess. Like I'm playing different parts, but I'm always the same person underneath. The programming was breaking down. Despite the legal and personal risks, I knew I had to return to Millbrook. The residents were beginning to question their reality, and I was probably the only person outside the project who understood what they were experiencing. I drove back to Ohio in the fall of 2024, 5 years after my original investigation. Millbrook looked exactly the same. The same neat houses, the same small downtown, the same peaceful atmosphere. But as I walked through the streets, I could see subtle changes in the residents' behavior. They moved with less certainty than before. Conversations seemed more hesitant, more questioning. People stood in front of mirrors longer than necessary, studying their reflections with expressions of unease. I checked into the Millbrook Inn under a false name. The desk clerk, the same person who'd checked me in years before, though he didn't seem to remember me, appeared troubled in a way that was hard to define. "First time in Millbrook?" he asked, the same question as before. "Yes," I lied. "Nice town," he said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "Quiet folks? Everyone looks out for each other." The phrase sounded rehearsed, as if he was reciting lines he wasn't sure he believed anymore. Over the next few days, I observed the gradual breakdown of the psychological programming that had maintained Millbrook for decades. Residents were beginning to notice inconsistencies in their memories, similarities in their appearance, and patterns in their community that didn't make sense. I watched a group of teenagers gathered in the town square, comparing their driver's licenses and commenting on how similar their ID photos looked. A meeting of the town council devolved into confused arguments about whether certain events had actually happened or were just shared dreams. Most significantly, Sheriff Collins had begun investigating his own department's records, finding discrepancies between what he remembered and what was documented in official files. The crisis point came when I witnessed a confrontation between two residents outside the grocery store. Robert Thompson and David Peterson were arguing about whether they'd known each other as children, each claiming memories of the other that contradicted their supposed life histories. "I remember you from elementary school," Thompson was insisting. "You sat behind me in Mrs. Anderson's third-grade class." "That's impossible," Peterson replied. "I grew up in Michigan. I didn't move to Millbrook until I was 25. But I remember you here. I have clear memories of us as kids." "So do I. But that can't be right." They were both correct. Their implanted memories contained overlapping elements because they were based on the same template, modified with different details to create the illusion of separate histories. But as the programming deteriorated, the underlying similarities were becoming apparent. I realized that the residents of Millbrook were on the verge of discovering the truth about their nature, with or without my intervention. The psychological conditioning that had maintained their artificial identities for decades was failing, and they were beginning to see through the illusion of their separate existences. I could either let them struggle through this revelation on their own, or I could help them understand what was happening to them. It was the most difficult ethical decision I'd ever faced. By revealing the truth, I would destroy their sense of identity and shatter their understanding of reality. But by remaining silent, I would abandon them to face an incomprehensible crisis without any context or support. I chose to help them. I arranged a meeting with Sheriff Collins, using my real name and FBI credentials. He remembered me from my previous visit, though his memories were confused and contradictory. "Agent Martinez," he said when we met at his office, "I've been thinking about your last visit. You asked questions about missing families, but I can't remember the details clearly. It's like trying to remember a dream." "Sheriff Collins, what I'm about to tell you will be difficult to believe and even more difficult to accept. But you deserve to know the truth about your community." I spent the next 3 hours explaining the Millbrook project to a man who discovered that everything he thought he knew about himself was a carefully constructed lie. I showed him the classified documents I'd smuggled out of FBI files, the DNA test results, and the video footage of the underground research facility. Sheriff Collins's reaction was exactly what I'd expected. Denial, followed by anger, followed by a kind of existential horror as the full implications sank in. "You're telling me I'm not real?" he asked finally. "You're real," I assured him. "Your thoughts, your emotions, your experiences, they're all real. But your memories have been artificially created, and your genetics were designed in a laboratory. What about my wife, my children? They're as real as you are. They have the same artificial origins, but their love for you and yours for them is genuine. How many of us know? As far as I'm aware, you're the first." Sheriff Collins sat in silence for a long time, processing information that challenged every assumption about his existence. Finally, he looked up at me with an expression of grim determination. "What do we do now?" Sheriff Collins and I decided to reveal the truth to the entire community at once, rather than let the information spread through rumors and partial explanations. We called a town meeting for the following evening, announcing it as a discussion about important community matters. Nearly the entire adult population of Millbrook attended. They filled the town hall, their identical faces showing a mixture of curiosity and unease. Many had been experiencing the same memory inconsistencies and identity confusion that had troubled Sheriff Collins. Standing before a room full of people who all looked the same was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. But as I began to explain the truth about their community, I watched their faces change from confusion to understanding to horror. "You are all genetically identical," I told them. "You were created in laboratories as part of a research project designed to study human behavior and social dynamics. Your memories were implanted, your personalities programmed, and your community established as a controlled environment for scientific observation." The reaction was immediate and intense. Some people cried, others shouted questions, many simply sat in stunned silence. The revelation that their entire existence was part of an experiment shattered their understanding of themselves and their world. Robert Thompson stood up, his face twisted with anguish. "Are you telling us we're not real people? That our lives, our families, our relationships, none of it matters?" "Your relationships matter," I replied. "Your feelings are real, your experiences are valid, your connections to each other are genuine. The fact that your origins are artificial doesn't diminish the reality of what you've built together." "But we're all the same person," said Mrs. Davidson. "How can we be individuals if we're genetically identical?" "Genetics don't determine personality or identity," I explained. "Even with identical DNA, each of you has developed into a unique individual through your experiences and choices. You may share the same face, but you've become different people." The meeting continued for hours, with residents asking questions, expressing anger, and trying to come to terms with the impossible truth about their existence. Some refused to believe what I was telling them, insisting that their memories were real and their identities authentic. Others accepted the revelation with surprising resilience, as if they'd suspected something was wrong all along. The revelation of the Millbrook Project's true nature created chaos in the community. Some residents demanded to leave immediately, wanting to escape what they now saw as a prison disguised as a town. Others insisted on staying, arguing that their home was real to them regardless of its artificial origins. Families struggled to understand their relationships in light of the revelation that they were all genetically identical. Parents questioned their love for children who shared their exact DNA, while spouses wondered if their attraction to each other was based on artificial programming rather than genuine emotion. The younger residents adapted more quickly than the adults. Teenagers who'd been troubled by their unusual uniformity found relief in finally understanding why they all looked the same. Children seemed almost untroubled by the revelation, accepting their artificial origins as simply another fact about their world. But the community's biggest challenge was practical: what to do next. Within 48 hours of the town meeting, Millbrook was surrounded by federal agents from multiple agencies. The security breach I'd created by revealing classified information had triggered an immediate response designed to contain the damage and protect the integrity of the remaining research sites. I was arrested on charges of violating the Espionage Act, sedition, and breach of national security. The residents of Millbrook were quarantined while government officials decided how to handle a population of research subjects who now knew the truth about their existence. During my interrogation, Director Smith, the unnamed official I'd met years earlier, made the government's position clear. "Agent Martinez, you've destroyed decades of valuable research and endangered the psychological well-being of thousands of innocent people. The residents of Millbrook were living productive, happy lives until you decided to interfere. They deserve to know the truth about themselves." Did they? Look at what your truth has accomplished. Families torn apart, individuals questioning their most basic sense of identity, a community in chaos. Was this revelation worth the psychological trauma you've caused? She had a point. Many of the Millbrook residents were struggling to cope with the knowledge of their artificial origins. Depression, anxiety, and identity crises were rampant throughout the community. Some had suffered complete psychological breakdowns and required intensive psychiatric care. But others had found strength in the truth. They'd begun forming support groups, helping each other navigate their new understanding of themselves. Some had developed a fierce pride in their unique origins, seeing themselves as pioneers in human development rather than victims of scientific experimentation. My case became a cause célèbre among civil rights organizations and government transparency advocates, though most of the details remained classified. The charges against me were serious enough to result in life imprisonment, but public pressure and media attention forced the government to consider alternatives. The Millbrook residents themselves became my strongest advocates. Despite the trauma of learning the truth about their origins, many testified on my behalf, arguing that they had a right to understand their own nature and that I had performed a service by revealing information that was being withheld from them. Sheriff Collins spoke at my sentencing hearing. "Agent Martinez gave us something more valuable than comfortable ignorance. She gave us the truth about ourselves. Yes, that truth was painful. Yes, it disrupted our lives and challenged everything we thought we knew. But it also gave us the power to make informed decisions about our future." The judge, faced with testimony from the very people I was accused of harming, sentenced me to time served and probation rather than the decades in prison the prosecutors had requested. I was released from federal custody with restrictions on my movement and communication, but I was allowed to maintain contact with the Millbrook community as they worked to rebuild their society with full knowledge of their origins. The transformation was remarkable. Once the initial trauma of revelation had passed, the residents began to embrace their unique situation with creativity and determination. They formed the first community of conscious human clones, developing new social structures and relationships based on their shared genetic heritage. Some residents chose to leave Millbrook, seeking to build new lives in the outside world. The government provided them with new identities and support services, though many struggled to adapt to life among genetically diverse populations. Others decided to stay and transform Millbrook into something unprecedented, a community that celebrated rather than concealed its artificial origins. They opened their town to researchers, journalists, and ethicists interested in studying the implications of human cloning and artificial community development. The underground research facility was converted into a museum and educational center, where visitors could learn about the history of the Millbrook Project and its implications for future developments in genetic engineering and social science. The revelation of the Millbrook Project sparked national debates about human experimentation, government secrecy, and the ethics of genetic engineering. Congressional hearings were held, leading to new regulations on human research and greater oversight of classified scientific programs. Other communities, similar to Millbrook, were gradually revealed and given the choice of learning the truth about their origins. Some chose knowledge. Others preferred to maintain their artificial ignorance. The government was forced to respect both decisions while providing support for communities that chose transparency. The scientific data collected from decades of observation in laboratory towns like Millbrook was made available to academic researchers, leading to breakthroughs in understanding human social behavior, community development, and genetic influences on personality. But perhaps most importantly, the residents of Millbrook had proven that human identity and dignity transcend the circumstances of one's origins. Despite learning that their entire existence was part of an experiment, they had maintained their humanity, their relationships, and their capacity for growth and change. My decision to reveal the truth about Millbrook came with significant personal consequences. My FBI career was over, my security clearance permanently revoked, and my future employment prospects severely limited. I faced ongoing legal restrictions and government surveillance that would continue for the rest of my life. But I also gained something invaluable: the knowledge that I had helped human beings understand their own nature and make informed choices about their existence. The residents of Millbrook had thanked me for giving them the truth, even though that truth came with pain and disruption. In quiet moments, I sometimes wondered if Director Smith and the other project officials had been right. Maybe the residents of Millbrook would have been happier living in ignorance, accepting their artificial memories as real and their programmed identities as authentic. But happiness built on lies is fragile and incomplete. The residents of Millbrook who chose to face the truth about themselves had gained something more valuable than comfort. They had gained agency over their own lives. Today, Millbrook, Ohio exists as a unique community in human history, a town populated by conscious clones who have chosen to build their society with full knowledge of their artificial origins. They've become advocates for genetic research transparency, human rights in scientific experimentation, and the ethical development of biotechnology. The children being born in Millbrook now are the products of relationships between genetically identical individuals, creating new questions about genetics, identity, and human diversity. They're being raised with complete knowledge of their origins and heritage, growing up as the first generation of humans to know from birth that they're the products of laboratory creation. Other laboratory towns revealed after Millbrook have taken different approaches. Some have embraced transparency like Millbrook. Others have chosen to maintain their artificial ignorance, and still others have disbanded entirely with their residents, scattering to join the genetically diverse population of the outside world. The Millbrook project continues, but now as an open research initiative with full informed consent from all participants. The community has become a partner in studying their own social development rather than unwitting subjects of secret experimentation. The case of Millbrook raises fundamental questions that society is still grappling with. If human cloning becomes technologically feasible and socially acceptable, what rights do clones have? How do we define individual identity when genetics are artificially controlled? What ethical obligations do researchers have to their subjects? And what rights do subjects have to understand their own nature? The residents of Millbrook have proven that human dignity and individual worth aren't dependent on genetic diversity or natural origins. They've shown that people can adapt to extraordinary revelations about themselves while maintaining their essential humanity. But they've also demonstrated the psychological cost of discovering that one's entire understanding of self was based on carefully constructed lies. The trauma of revelation, even when the truth ultimately proved liberating, cannot be dismissed as irrelevant to the ethical calculation. As I write this account, 5 years after the revelation in Millbrook, I'm still in contact with many of the residents. They've built something remarkable, a community that celebrates its artificial origins while maintaining all the warmth, complexity, and meaning of naturally occurring human societies. Sheriff Collins, now calling himself Community Coordinator Collins, recently sent me a photo from Millbrook's first annual Founders Day celebration, a holiday they created to commemorate the day they learned the truth about themselves. The photo shows hundreds of people with identical faces, all smiling genuinely, all celebrating their unique place in human history. "Thank you for giving us the choice," his accompanying note said, "even when the choice was painful." That's what the Millbrook case ultimately comes down to. Choice. The choice to know difficult truths rather than comfortable lies. The choice to face reality even when it challenges everything you thought you knew about yourself. The choice to build meaning and relationships based on honesty rather than deception. I made the choice to reveal the truth despite the personal and professional costs. The residents of Millbrook made the choice to face that truth despite the psychological trauma it caused. Together, we proved that human beings have the strength to confront even the most fundamental questions about their own nature and identity. The town where everyone had the same face became the place where people discovered that identity runs much deeper than genetics, that humanity transcends the circumstances of one's creation, and that the truth, however difficult, is always preferable to even the most comfortable lie. Some nights, I still dream about those identical faces turning toward me in the town hall, waiting to hear the truth about themselves. In my dreams, they always thank me for giving them the choice between ignorance and knowledge. In reality, most of them did too.